It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Tristan Smith, Reader in Energy and Shipping at University College London. He has been a leading voice in shipping decarbonization for many years, and his team has been closely involved in the work on the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study. We're also extremely happy to have Tristan and UCL, but also UMAS as knowledge partners to the Getting to Zero Coalition, and we really value their input. So Tristan, over to you.
Thank you, Kasper, and good morning, everyone. Can I do a quick check that the sound and the slides are working? Anyone give me a nod or a...
It's working, Tristan.
Great, thank you. Good. Thank you for the introduction, and nice to be able to share some of this information with everybody. The slides that I'm going to present are our personal take on the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study. UMAS were leading the inventory work behind the study, so we produced the analysis of all the emissions over the period 2012 to 18. We weren't particularly involved in the projections and the scenarios, but I'll have a couple of slides on that and try and answer questions on that. The study itself is in the public domain already, and there's also a set of slides on the pre-read with a bit more detail in them, but it hasn't been debated and accepted by the MEPC, and so these are our interpretation. They're not the position of the IMO, and they are subject to how that debate unfolds at the MEPC 75 meeting, and whether or not the study's findings are accepted by that committee. So with those caveats given, I'd just like to start with a very brief slide on the context and the backdrop to this material. The graph that I've used here is taken from a paper by Simon Bullock and a team of authors at Manchester University about shipping and its alignment to the Paris Agreement and its climate targets. And this uses three different curves to highlight 2 points. One, which is that basically climate science and our efforts now to avoid dangerous climate change are gambling. We do not know for certain what level of anthropogenic emissions of any species will cause us to go into runaway climate change, catastrophic impacts in various ecosystems or geographical landscapes, but we can estimate what the probability of exceeding certain temperatures is. And that's what these three curves on the graph show. If we take a lower rate of decarbonisation, the blue curve, then we have a much lower probability of succeeding in restricting temperature rise above 1.5. And 1.5 is the threshold that is where we start to see some very dangerous climate change consequences. So that's one interpretation of how we can ban our gambling on this. And those three curves have been drawn assuming shipping provides a proportionate response to the Paris Agreement. So there are arguments for why it should have a bigger carbon budget, there are arguments why it should have a smaller one, but that's the main landscape. We're at a point in time now in 2020 where we're faced with how much do we want to gamble on our collective futures across all sectors and their respective efforts. The work that I'm presenting was undertaken by a team of about 9 organisations. Those included ourselves, but representatives from across 6 countries and 4 continents, and unfortunately not, in this case, representatives from the African continent, which is something that is still an issue with the participation and representation in the IMO. So the question that immediately arises and is often looked at is, are emissions rising? And this is just a table with both the total emissions that include domestic shipping and fishing, as well as international shipping, alongside estimates for international shipping emissions through 2 different methods. And I'll talk a little bit about why there are 2 different methods for international shipping emissions, which is the main focus of the IMO. The IMO is not mandated internationally with controlling domestic emissions. Its purview, its responsibility is the international sector. That's why it's interested in understanding the portion of total emissions that it has within its responsibility. And for all of those indicators, we can show that by 2018, we'd exceeded levels that the shipping emissions were at in 2012. And accordingly, we'd also grown in most cases the share of emissions of total anthropogenic emissions that shipping contributes over a period by which we obviously had some regulation in force, the EDI and SEMP, but very little policy, but clearly a lot of knowledge that we needed to be reversing and reducing emissions. If we look into the future scenarios that were produced by the report, these are actually for lower growth in emissions than was estimated in the third greenhouse gas study, which is often quoted as having 50 to 250% growth in emissions. There are a few different explanations that it's worth just giving very briefly here for why these scenarios are for lower growth in emissions. One is because the third IMO greenhouse gas study included many economic scenarios that were associated with much higher temperature temperature increases over this century, and therefore those higher temperature rises had higher demand growth, especially for obviously fossil fuel commodities over the period. With the removal of those assumptions and those scenarios, we're restricted now to scenarios that only have 2 degrees or lower temperature rise, and some of the demand growth drivers are less. But the main explanation for the lower levels here is that there's been a revision in the method used to connect GDP growth and GDP forecasts to trade growth. And that's come about because of a lot of analysis undertaken on data from the last decade, which wasn't available in 2014. Clearly, the global financial crisis has had some structural impact on trade growth and its relationship to economic development, and that's manifested in these plots. Nevertheless, the news here is not good in relation to the context slide I showed at the beginning, which outlines how significant the rate of decarbonisation needs to be. Clearly, growing or emissions staying constant is not sufficient for the decade that we now face. There are a couple of different measures of carbon intensity that are studied, and this is a key parameter in the study because many people are currently focused on the 40% by 2030 objective, which is enshrined within the IMO's initial greenhouse gas reduction strategy, and is a more tangible, immediate goal for people to focus on before they look at the 2050 target. I know that's not necessarily what the Getting to Zero coalition is targeting when it's come up with its objective of zero emission fleet, commercially viable and scalable from 2030, but it's important for, I guess, a lot of the companies here, so I wanted to spend 2 seconds on it. One of those metrics, the AER, gives us slightly lower performance carbon intensity improvement since 2008 than the EEOI. So that's the more conservative of the 2 metrics if you're a policymaker and you want to set a more ambitious objective for the coming decade. If we've already done 20% of the 40%, then we would still need to do another 20% in the remaining decade. If we've done 30%, we've only got another 10% to do. And that's all assuming that what we actually need to do is the 40% objective that was set in the initial strategy. So my main comment here is not, it's important to choose AER or EUI depending on whether you want a hard target or a soft target. It's really that 40% is inadequate. And I've tried to capture that in the graph here, which plots the absolute greenhouse gas emissions, which you can see have more or less sort of flatlined since 2008 relative to the 2012 and 2018 period that we have actual data for. And as we go out to 2030, if we did a 40%, we'd either be increasing our absolute emissions or just holding them constant as a sector. And again, I would make the point that isn't adequate in the climate emergency that we now face. So to actually make any attempt to get close to even the lowest ambition, the lower probability 1.5 line, you would need to do a 60% and have the AER, the 20% so far carbon metric enshrined in policy. So there's a real difficulty that the sector faces because the initial strategy has this 2030 target very out of step with what the climate science tells us is necessary, and arguably what some of the effort so far has shown us is viable or possible. And so that will create a lot of uncertainty, I think, for the sector whilst they wait to see whether the IMO strengthens those targets, with the most obvious date for that being 2023, and potentially giving a significant shock to the sector as those targets are revised. The next point to make is that the study has reevaluated this question about what is the share of international emissions. And this was actually mentioned yesterday because it relates to whether national governments might step in and be more active in encouraging the sector's decarbonisation. And there's actually some very good evidence and therefore news, I think, for the Getting to Zero Coalition in that analysis. The improved quality of data that we had available when we were doing this study, as opposed to the third IMO greenhouse gas study, and advances in the algorithms used to process that data, enable us to look at every individual vessel's individual voyages and therefore allocate emissions on a per voyage basis that enables the application of what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, advises is the right way of allocating domestic and international emissions. And I've tried to show this in this graph or this diagram here, that every ship, even if it's internationally trading, will have some portion of its emissions that are actually within a domestic allocation or budget and therefore belong to the country that they are emitted in. If a container ship stops in multiple ports in China, for example, before undertaking a voyage into Europe or North America, those emissions that occur between the Chinese ports would be allocated to China's domestic emissions and not to the IMO's responsibility by the IPCC definition. And this has shown, when we estimate using this method, that actually domestic shippings are approximately 30% of total shipping emissions, which is twice, double what we thought in previous estimates, which were based on ship types and sizes active in either international or domestic shipping. So there's a much stronger justification for governments to step in and get involved in how they incentivise the decarbonisation of shipping now they have more responsibility. A quick comment on two emission species, which I guess we're all aware of, but often don't get included in the discussions: methane and black carbon. So CO2 remains, regardless of whether you include black carbon or not, the dominant emission. It's either 91 or 98% of the total greenhouse gas emissions of the fleet today. It would have a very significant role, black carbon, if it were included. It's about 7% of total shipping emissions. And if that is finally sort of agreed upon as something that we could characterise, and it's been up for debate at the IMO for some years now on how exactly you account for black carbon and what it is. If we could agree on a definition, then it would become a significant greenhouse gas that would encourage regulation and policy to control it. Methane is the other one, which obviously I think we know has significant greenhouse gas emissions already. It's not debated on how it's defined, but it actually grew by a very large percentage over the period 2012 to 18, much greater than the share of LNG as a marine fuel. And it grew by a large percentage because of the use of dual fuel, diesel combustion cycle machinery that was combusting methane and had large amounts of slip. And whilst that might be now starting to be controlled more in current engines or in future engines, it shows how if you don't control for an emission species that's an important greenhouse gas, it can still have very rapid growth and cause significant problems. So I think both of those analyses point to the likelihood of future regulation. There's a lot of insight that can be gained on the breakdown of fuel consumption and emissions within the global fleet, the top 6 ship types that are contributing most to fuel demand can be shown. That doesn't necessarily give us insight into which ships it might be most suitable to be first movers, because large fuel consumption isn't necessarily the sector that has the first mover advantage, but it gives us some insight as to how much of different fleets would need to get to zero in order to make up, for example, the 5% figure that we were talking about yesterday as a target for a portion of the fuel or the energy demand that is zero emission fuel by 2030. So I won't dwell on that, but there's a lot of detailed analysis that can be done using the statistics from the study. Given that Global Maritime Forum is behind the Poseidon Principles, and I thought I'd just share one quick slide on how we estimate that actually the 11% gain between 2012 and 2018, which is enshrined in the decarbonisation curve, is very close to the actual carbon intensity performance. Doesn't matter whether you use AER or EEOI for the period 2012 and 18, they're actually very similar. The actual carbon intensity performance of the global fleet on average was about 11%. So this doesn't necessarily say that that's going to be easy to maintain, and I would suspect it's not without a significant shift in alternative fuels, but it does show us that there is no good reason to be particularly alarmed by that curve or the trajectory set by Poseidon Principles, at least over the period to 2018. And then, because of the discussions around fuel that we're having later today, I wanted to just add this slide, which details some of the underlying assumptions around alternative fuels within the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study and how they're produced into a marginal abatement cost curve. I've extracted that as well as the underlying fuel cost assumptions in the study. The curves show much more conservative estimates for the cost of decarbonisation than analysis that we produced. We would normally have carbon prices closer to 200, somewhere between $100 and $200 a tonne, as being the cost efficiency of decarbonising shipping. And the explanation for that is the data that you can see in the table, which has quite a high cost for some of the zero carbon fuels. Ammonia price per tonne at $660 in 2030 and $660 also in 2050. Whereas there are many producers who I guess are in this group who would argue that they could foresee much lower prices, which would have a corresponding much lower impact on the marginal abatement cost. So I just wanted to highlight that. So to conclude, to some extent, I mean, there isn't anything very unexpected in the fourth IMO greenhouse gas study. Most of the macro trends, I think, were fairly intuitive for those who are working in the sector. It's more that this is the sort of official document that the IMO will now use for its, or hopefully now use for its decision making and policy design. There's the trend that we've seen, and there is good news on carbon intensity improving, but this just needs to be put in the context of the challenge we have ahead. We can't do marginal increments and expect to avoid dangerous climate change. We need radical change. There's a key finding for me, which is that there are these higher quantities of emissions associated with domestic shipping, and therefore implications for national governments. The drivers of falling carbon intensity continue to be operational. There's a lot of unused installed power in the fleet because of locked-in slow steaming. We didn't talk about that very much, but it obviously relates to the ongoing discussion about how we most effectively regulate with short-term measures. Methane and black carbon are very important, but they're not yet regulated. And a small number of ship types regulate most of the emissions. There are some relatively easy gains for very large emission reductions, but those obviously need to be figured out relative to commercial realities within the sector. And then finally, as I guess we all know, decarbonisation requires moving beyond fossil fuels, and the details remain unclear, and this urgently needs more research and effort. The fact that there can still be marginal abatement cost curves with such varying numbers in them and input assumptions is a worrying sign, given where we are at this in the timescales of having to adopt them. I'm sorry that was a rather quick run through some results, but if there's any questions I can answer of them, I'd be very happy to do so.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you for a very, very good presentation with a lot of food for thought. I can also see in the chat that we have some questions. I'll just encourage you, if you have questions, please do put them into the chat, because I think this is a really unique opportunity to deep dive into the details. One question that came up was related to the slide around the Poseidon Principles. The question relates to how can you calculate the Poseidon Principle trajectory back from 2011 when the reporting is only starting in 2020? Can you elaborate a little bit on that slide?
Or let me just put it up just to. So the trajectory came from the third IMO greenhouse gas study that studied the period 2007 to 2012, and then gave us insights into the relative carbon intensity of each of the subsectors of the fleet. So we had data in the 2012 study of the carbon intensity of container ships relative to tankers, and within the tankers, for example, carbon intensities of VLCCs, Aframaxes, Suezmaxes, etc. And so that gives you an important starting point, because without that level of granularity, you can't have targets or curves that would be appropriate for a whole fleet of ships, which is a key component within the Poseidon Principles. So these set the trajectories, but the scoring, the analysis itself is obviously done on actual data, which is, as the question points out, only available from this year, or 2019, in the 2020 report onwards. And so that gives us that's the measurement of performance relative to the trajectory. The trajectory comes from historical analysis and a projection of what would be needed from the climate science, and it's just a line in the sand against which the actual performance is measured.
Thank you. I think another issue that we've seen some question on is related to the role of domestic shipping, and one question was related to is this additional domestic part of the maritime transport chain, is that related to a few specific countries? So I think in your presentation you mentioned China, or is that more sort of scattered across the world? Is it a few big countries that makes this happen, or is it all over the world?
I didn't mean to pick on China. I'm very sorry if that was implied. It's just an easy example because I guess we're familiar with container ships not multi-stopping in China. But yes, it happens in all countries with a significant coastline. I imagine it's not massive in Denmark and other countries that might have smaller numbers of major ports. But if you take countries like North America and even quite a few European countries that have significant coastline and multiple ports, there are going to be countries that will have significant domestic emissions associated with that, and obviously countries that use their maritime transport as a means to move goods around. So again, this is not picking on Norway, but as you have harder logistics interconnections on land and favourable opportunities to move goods by sea, then you might have more significant domestic emissions. So it's going to vary very significantly. We've just done an estimate of the share of developed economies emissions, and it's, I think, I don't actually know the details very well yet, but I think it's about 50%, maybe Peter can help us out when we go on to this later in the day, of that total. So it's a very significant share in developed economies, and those developed economies are the ones that will have this in their NDCs and have a real imperative or an onus on them, given CBDRRC, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities. Given that principle, they have a real imperative to decarbonize their domestic fleet and to really look at that, at investing significant resources in doing that. So I think this isn't a trivial share of the emissions, and it isn't a trivial investment prospect for governments and for public-private collaborations.
And I know, Tristan, that you don't have a crystal ball, so answer this question with as many caveats as you want. But I think one of the things we can see in the questions in the chat is also what will be the impact of this study in the IMO debate, because I think as you presented it, it makes a pretty clear case that the need for urgent action is now, and that the targets that have been set and the measures that have been adopted to achieve these targets are not sufficient to drive the level of change that we need to see happening. How do you expect governments to respond to this, and do you see this study as perhaps accelerating the policy debates at the IMO?
I think so. I've interpreted it through the lens that we interpret our work, which is so I'm glad to hear that was the interpretation that people took from my presentation. But there's enough material in here that people can selectively quote that show that things are much better than we thought they were. You know, you could selectively choose to say, well, the scenarios are now for much lower growth, and yes, they're not for emission reduction in line with the IMO initial strategy, but under current policy, we now have a much lower projection, and so we've got much less of a gap to close than we used to have, or we thought we used to have. So that's one way in which people can be kind of optimistic. The other way is they can say, well, we said we needed to do 40%, we've already done 30% on carbon intensity. Basically, it's business as usual out to 2030, because we can expect another 10% just naturally from market forces over this coming decade. So it's really difficult to say exactly how this will impact those debates, because depending on who amplifies the messages and how they selectively use the material, you can spin in a number of different ways. And we will do our best to be part of those debates and try and sort of call out where we think that the material is being used in a disingenuous way or in a kind of misrepresentative way. But it's very hard to control in that forum how science is used in practice. But I do think that the general impression that I've seen in the reaction in the media over when this was launched a few weeks ago, the majority of the tone was this is just not acceptable. We can't have increasing emissions at this point in time. We're going to have to increase our ambition. And And I guess you could say, well, a lot of that ambition is already being increased because we're now in the initial strategy, we're implementing the outcomes of that agreement. But I think to be complacent that that initial strategy won't be revised, as we've been saying for some time, is very risky.
Okay, so there's still a need for all actors to engage in the debate to help actually provide some of the perspectives about the need for urgent action. I think just one follow-up question related to this is related to the regulation of methane at the IMO level. So when do you think, or do you think that this will be regulated anytime soon by the IMO?
Yes, I'm not completely on top of the EDI debate, but I think there's already something that's quite advanced for including it in EDI, such that it would then be sort of factored into the way that we do the carbon factor in the EDI formula. But there's a parallel set of discussions which are more generic, which are about life cycle guidelines, which include other species of greenhouse gases. And that is another means that this would enter into the regulation, or at least the regulatory policy design space. And I think the timeline on that is very difficult because of COVID. It's been delayed. It was supposed to have been discussed in April this year. I would have thought that will take 1 or 2 years to become very clear. And over that time period, you could then expect the candidate policies that would actually enact that to also be developed. So I think we've got 2 or 3 years maximum of timescale before significant implementation of anything to control methane. Whether or not that controls existing fleet, or whether it controls just the new builds in the way that we do with NOx emissions, I can't sort of guess at this point in time. But clearly, you know, existing fleet have significant methane slip, as we have seen from the estimates of methane emissions over the 12 to 18 period. And so not to control that would seem a bit unfair for those who are building new builds in the future.
Thank you, Tristan. Thank you so much. I know we didn't manage to answer all of the questions, but I think if Tristan is willing, we'll gather the questions that were not answered and we'll put the answers on top link. So thank you so much, Tristan. Thanks for sharing. I think this was really interesting. And I know Tristan will be around, so I think there will be other opportunities to engage with Tristan over the coming days. So thank you so much.